It is absolutely wonderful to be here. I'm Allegra Spender, the federal member for Wentworth. And here, delighted to be here with my colleagues Zali Steggall from Warringah and Kate Chaney from Curtin. I don't know how much of that little bit of exchange you heard before about us teasing each other, but I think it shows the sort of the fun actually you have, to be honest, as community independents, as well as very proud of the serious work we do. I'm joining from Gadigal land. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also note the enormous work of the communities and the community independents in particular the communities of us, the independents in the voice election, because I think we're very proud of how our communities got involved and worked together on that campaign. Really, my session today is really about telling a bit of the stories of Kate, Zali, and mine, because they're different, because we represent different communities. But really want to just to tell you about what it's like to drive a community, be part of a community independent movement in our communities. So, any questions if we manage to do that, and tell you a bit about how the crossbench works together, and I hopefully get you excited about the possibilities of this sort of work in your own communities. So what I want to do was to start out with really a bit of a question for Kate, Zali, and then I'll cover from my community's point of view as well, a bit about, in your community, how did the movement get started? How has the movement evolved? Zali, you've been in for, I think, almost 5 years now. So you've seen quite a lot of, change and development in your community, but Kate and I, it's only been 2 years. So love to hear about how your movements got started and how they evolved, because we each have different stories to tell. And I think those reflect, the different communities we're from. Maybe Zali, do you want to start first? You got your...
And good morning, everyone. It's very exciting to hear just how successful this convention is online and how many of you are here. And I guess big shout outs. I believe we've got a huge amount of electorates represented today. I think it's something like 125, which is huge. Fantastic. We've come a long way. Allegra, as you say, it's been 5 years, which is amazing. Time flies when you're having fun. And I obviously also would like to pay my respects to traditional elders of the land I'm coming from here in Warringah. But yeah, look, the journey for Warringah has been quite an incredible one. We always had strong independent politics at local government level and at state government level. In Manly, we had a number of independent MPs, but we hadn't quite cracked it at federal level. There had been some attempts over the years. A local very popular mayor had a go back in 2001, if people remember the Tampa election, had tried to get rid of Tony Abbott back then, and that hadn't quite succeeded. We then saw a strong independent push in 2016 with James Matheson having a go again at Tony Abbott. And I think it was that frustration was bubbling away in the community, and we had about 5 or 6 different community groups were active in gaining support, especially around the marriage equality plebiscite. And there was a lot of groups sort of, really coming up through the community, expressing their dissatisfaction with the current representation and looking for alternatives. And actually many here in this convention were involved in bringing some of those groups together, and they really recognised the benefit of working together rather than sort of parallel to each other or at cross purposes with each other, which often does happen in communities where you've got multiple groups and everyone kind of sticks to their plan and no one kind of comes together. And so the coming together was incredibly effective. And I came along late 2018. I hadn't been contacted by any of the groups or any people involved, but through complete coincidence, a friend of mine was a runner, lived next door to Mark Kelly, who had started Vote Tony Out, who was one of those groups. I bought a Vote Tony Out T-shirt for myself and all my family for Christmas. We started talking, debating, looking at what the groups were looking for, what was needed. I was a pretty frustrated constituent at the time under Tony Abbott, and from there everyone was prepared to lean in. I didn't hesitate to step up and say, look, I'm willing to give it a shot. And all those groups came together to say, yep, you fit the bill of what we're hoping for. And we all really worked hard, and it was a very intense 5 months, but a really, it's a winner-takes-all game when it comes to politics in and elections. You're essentially launching a new business when you launch a campaign, and once you're in the market, you've got, pretty much 4 months. We had back in 2019, you've got 4 months to win the market. So, and there's no prize for second place, right? It's only the first person to get selected. So it was incredibly intense, but really amazing to see the community and all those groups bubble up and get organised. And we had, you nearly have like a war room where during the campaign, everyone is very organised. Everyone had very clear sense of ownership around their roles and what we were doing, growing that community movement. I think in the first year we got to about 1,000 or 1,200 volunteers, which was huge, and just getting that community spirit of everyone willing to put up core flutes, wear the T-shirt at the supermarket shopping. We had the caps, the hats, the everything, and from a community that hadn't really talked politics before, it was kind of all kept very low key. All of a sudden, everyone was out and proud and talking and wearing their shirts, and it was quite an amazing journey. And it builds from there, matures over 5 years. But so many people involved in my team are still the people that were there 5 years ago, which is super exciting.
Wonderful. And Zali, just how has it changed over time? So you talked about that first election. How has your community in the community part of the politics changed and evolved, and what have you learned through that journey?
Yeah, look, what's interesting is a lot of people, we're very passionate about issues often, or just generally, but you don't always totally understand how government works, how politics works, right? Even the complexity between local government, state and federal. And so one of our big goals has been pulling back the curtain on Canberra so that more people in the community can understand how Canberra works, and understand the opportunities to be involved and how you can participate and move the dial. And then obviously bringing a bit of our community to Canberra is very, very key. So I think it's really matured in that you've got a core group of people that have, I guess, the time and opportunity to be involved. And they have very much remained the pillars of our community engagement in terms of being there to assist with policy work, with research, assist with the work around connecting to community, responding to emails, driving campaigns as well. If I think in the last 5 years, we've had a few key campaigns, the Climate Act Now, for example, obviously the Voice referendum, Truth in Political Advertising, and at each one, so they're big national ones, but you have local ones as well, from transport and housing and things like that. And each time the volunteers and the team, we do, shopping surveys and petitions. We do the door knocking, letterbox drops. And so the volunteers and the team at each sort of opportunity really hones in their skills and gets more and more involved in a much more, I think, targeted way. I think at the beginning it's very idealistic for better politics, and over time you grow to have that maybe a deeper sense of understanding of where the opportunities are. So, for example, really driving community to make submissions on policy areas in Canberra, and people really becoming getting more expertise around areas of policy. And so I think that's that maturing that I've seen, which is exciting, and people know and feel so much more confident having done it before. And you then are able to bring more people in, and new people come on board support, because it's not as daunting when you see people having fun and engaged, and really understanding the process. So it is fascinating to watch it evolve and become that little bit more, I guess, more experienced, more mature, and especially when it comes to the policy areas. That's where I really appreciate the amount of help I get from the community. This is a job that you cannot do on your own. As we all know, it's an endless amount of work, but it's with the kind of teams we have behind us that I think other MPs look on in wonder at what we are all able to cover, because we have the community with us.
That's incredible, Zali. And I have to say, when I think of Wentworth, I hear so much also from my volunteers, all the friendships that people have developed over time through this, all these people who said, I didn't realise there were so many people in my area who felt the same way and have gotten, have gotten a lot out of that personally. And then that's been my experience, obviously, as well. Of, the incredible friendships I've developed out of this has been remarkable. Kate, your story is different again. Love to hear the story of your community, how that started, how you got involved, and how that took you to the election and since.
Thanks very much, Allegra, and great, very excited to be here, and excited that so many people are on the call. So there were definitely some similarities, but more recently. So I've been in for 2 years, and only about 6 months out from the election, a group formed in Curtin Independent. And it was a small group of people who felt frustrated. They connected with people they knew, and the group grew, and they started to have those conversations about what are the things that we'd like to see done differently. They put an ad in the local paper. Someone actually pointed that out to me, and I said, no way. But then I was approached a few months afterwards and asked if I would have a conversation. And once I had a chat with these people who had formed this group, I thought, we share so many frustrations. And so I said yes, and we had a 4-month campaign. So it was the shortest campaign. It was incredibly intense and really, really good fun. And it blew me away that within a week we had 200 volunteers and no idea what to do with them. No one in the campaign team had any political experience. But when it comes down to it, it's really just about talking to people. And I think that for me is a really important thing to communicate in this session. Don't feel like you're not qualified and you can't do it. It is just about people organising. And we found people who had experience organising as PNC presidents or footy club, team managers, those sorts of skills are really useful. And ultimately it was about bringing this group of people together, reflecting their values and providing an alternative that was optimistic and positive. And it was really, really wonderful experience. And we've seen, and of that group that amassed in the lead up to the campaign, some have stayed engaged on an ongoing basis, and then others have said, wonderful, positive experience, really looking forward to, helping out next time round. And so people have different levels of engagement. And since then, similarly to Zali, we have done a lot of work that is driven by community, and we try to have a lot of community events around policy issues and put together submissions that on behalf of the community on different topics. So that's been, for me, it's been really important that I'm creating opportunities for people to engage with their democracy and have a say, because it feels like that was what was missing, and that's what people really want. And that's how we rebuild trust in democracy, is by giving that democracy back to people and saying, this is your democracy and you have the opportunity to be part of it. Mm-hmm. Might leave it there in the interest of getting through more questions. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I'll briefly then touch on Wentworth's experience. So Wentworth, again, was probably different again. You've heard from Voices for Wentworth. So they were a group who I think for a number of years were frustrated with what was happening in Canberra and wanted to build community engagement in democracy and discussion on key issues. But they were non-partisan and remained non-aligned actually throughout, the election and to this date. because their piece has always been about how to improve the quality of democratic discussion in Wentworth rather than, back a candidate. So they were doing that work, which was really sort of galvanising the community around issues, but not aligned. And then we had a small group of people in Wentworth who saw what Zali had done in Warringah, and also reflected that Karen Phelps had also been a member for Wentworth, for unfortunately only for 9 months because of the by-election, but was only narrowly defeated in the last election. And so they felt very strongly that there was an opportunity here as well. They talked to lots of, different people in the community. They approached me, and it took me, I'll be honest, some time to make the decision that I would stand. But I really felt, this was around the kind of the COP 26 that I finally made up my mind. I just felt, look, we just can't wait anymore for, real action on climate change. And frankly, in my case, I am extremely passionate about having a more diverse democracy and a more diverse range of people, and particularly women, but not only women, in Parliament. And I just didn't feel that was being delivered by the members that we had. And so we, then once we sort of, we had a funny experience actually where we were doing this launch event, and we were going to try and get a piece in the paper the day before the launch event. And then my opponent actually leaked my name a week before. So we're like, and I think that's life. That's actually what happens in this. It doesn't always go to plan. So, we ended up with a piece in the paper, thankfully, the week before, which I actually think was probably in the end better anyway, because it meant more people came to the launch event. So that was, so these things happen. And I guess what I would say from our experience, like similarly, we had hundreds and hundreds, up to I think 1,400 volunteers in the end. And it's a real experiment of what works. We decided, we learned, we watched what Zali did, we watched what other people were doing to galvanise and engage their communities, and we tried stuff. And some bits, worked well, and some bits I wanted to do a run club. That really never took off, sadly. But lots of other things did. We saw that Zali had swim caps. We learned, and we thought that was great. We did dog bandanas. We really focused on sort of community, transport hubs. So again, what I learned from that campaign piece was that you don't necessarily know it's going to work. You've got to try things. We did a lot of kind of policy-based discussions in the community, bringing, real expertise with, and I was one of the people on the panel to sort of discussing some of the challenges that people had. So, there were different ways of bringing people in. And I think, in community organisation, it's not been done really before. It's a long time since the major parties were truly grassroots organisations. And grassroots organisations means variability depending on who your community is and what works for your community. One thing I did a lot of was, going to people's houses, for houses of about sort of where people had about maybe 30 to 50 people, often in the sort of early evening. And that was a great chance to come, to, talk a bit about what I was trying to do, and really to listen from the community about what was important to them, what were the things they were concerned about, and what questions did they have for me. So that was probably one of the best things that we did to really get out in the community. And the most fun thing we did, I think we stole a little bit from Zali, was about 2 days before the election. There's a couple of big roads in Wentworth, and we had probably, a couple of hundred people holding Allegra signs up and down that road on the sort of 7:30 to 8:30 in the morning. And that, I think, was a real sort of show of power and support, and something that people still talk about. So it's different. Again, each community evolves and sort of has to play to what makes sense in your community. I wanted then to sort of jump up into the sort of compact with communities and that engagement on big issues, because for many of us and many of our communities, they got behind us because they want action on the things that are most important to them. Kate, you touched on it. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more on, how you engage your community on, on some of those major issues, and what some of those sessions and things have looked like? Kate, I can't hear you. Oh, no, you're here now. Maybe you could hear me. No, it's all good. I can hear you.
Oh, dear.
No, you're good.
Now? No, I think I have low bandwidth for some reason. Okay. So on some issues, you need that technical advice, and other issues are much more based on community views. And so we try and have a mix, but we do a lot of policy-based events with constituents. Probably the piece of work I'm most proud of on that front is our Curtains Pathway to Net Zero project, which we did over a year with 50 volunteers in 5 working groups, meeting fortnightly to be a fantastic report what it looked like in Curtin and
Kate,
local governments and also individuals. And that.
Kate, I'm going to cut you off, I'm afraid. I think your bandwidth's not working well, so I don't know if you can tether off your phone or something. I might go to Zali for a bit and see if we can get your internet slightly stronger.
Okay.
Zali, do you want to talk about, you've done some real campaigns you touched on, so the climate campaign
sure.
and Stop the Lies. Do you want to tell us a bit about how you worked with your community on that and your compact with communities on these major issues?
Yeah, so one of the things I guess I observed coming in, especially in my first term, was often independents on the crossbench would do really good work, but not enough people heard about it, and it didn't gain enough momentum. So I know, Rebecca Sharkey or Andrew Wilkie, things have, but it didn't always get the kind of momentum. So for me, the key was really putting a lot of effort and energy behind creating campaigns, which, whilst we know it can be difficult to get private members' bills passed through Parliament, you can really move the dial on the discussion and on where the benchmark needs to be for the party of government to actually legislate. So, for example, if I think of the Climate Act Now campaign around getting the country to commit to net zero by 2050, if we think back to last term, that was incredibly difficult. Like, the Morrison government did not want to go there. As we can see now with the Nationals, they're still very against the idea of committing to climate action and net zero. And to be fair, at the time, Labor did not want to talk climate because they felt that 2019 was a climate election that they had lost on their more ambitious targets. So when we launched Climate Act Now, it was really important to get as much popular support behind it and the community behind it. So it's around the forums, the town halls, talking about it with community. I guess I probably went about it slightly different to Kate in that I didn't do work groups to develop it. I do have a team of volunteers that are policy advisors that assist with researching around certain areas. But then for me, it was actually about going out to stakeholder groups to really get the private sector and other organisations from the Australian Institute, the Grattan Institute, the Business Council of Australia, all those different groups to come together to get behind policy approaches and campaigns. And then really important was with the community was getting the sign-ups and the support and the sharing it on social media. So people need to really have a buy-in, right? They need to feel that they have an ownership around this sort of policy proposal and what we're trying to do. So from surveys to polling to petitions to the letterbox drops, it's really everyone getting involved. And then we had an inquiry. I had the private members bill referred to inquiry. And so we had over 6,000 submissions to that inquiry. So then it's about I had a whole group of volunteers from the community who went through all the submissions and, categorised them and summarised them and put them together so that we had a really good visibility around the areas of concern or the objections or where people, what areas we needed to maybe make amendments to the private members bill. So for me, that was that real example where the community not only had said we want our voice heard, but then had that really direct way of saying, and this is what the policy looks like that we want to get behind, and this is how we can shape it. And so that's been an amazing journey, obviously still work in progress since we still have a long way to go on climate action. But we replicated that with truth in political advertising, again, getting the community behind it, understanding it, and then really championing it, because that makes a huge difference. Like Kate said, everyone is busy, right? People in the community, people have very busy lives and working. And so the big group that gets active at election time, everyone doesn't have that opportunity and that time available. But for those that do, it's incredible. I'm always just so thankful and amazed at how generous people are with their time and expertise. So as soon as there's an area that comes up that I don't particularly have much experience in, there are always people within our community group and our volunteer, base that have that expertise and step up and say, right, let's go through this area. At the moment, for example, on, maybe your area, Allegra, but, on tax and financial planning and some of the superannuation changes, I've had some, fantastic expertise from people within the community, volunteers who have experience. So I think that's the difference between, how we do it is it's not an assumption that we know everything on any one topic. It's going out to our base in our community for that expertise and always getting the feedback on legislation as well. For me, it's really important. We're in the habit. We always put up what the notice, when we get notified by government what the bills for the next sitting week are going to be, I always put it up on social media, always asking for people to give me their feedback. And there's always some bits of legislation that are really controversial that people want to engage with. So the amount of I do find I do most of it through the emails to the office and back, and with my team in terms of engaging with the community to make sure we're reflecting that and monitoring it. And then we, obviously having town halls and opportunities to all get together and discuss solutions and give the community that voice is really important.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. Kate, how are we doing? Do you want to jump back on? How's that bandwidth now?
How's that NBN?
You tell me. I'll see how we go.
That seems a bit better. Did you want to? Yeah, catch up.
That's right. I don't know how much for our Pathways Net Zero project, but that was very much a community-driven project. We had.
Kate, you might have to turn your video off. I'm afraid your bandwidth is a bit dodgy.
We lost Kate.
I think we may have lost Kate. Well, look, I'm going to jump to the next question, and I might start with this one, which is, how the crossbench work together. And I think it is let me talk, it's incredibly constructive. And that's both at the House, but also in the Senate, sort of increasingly with, some members of the Senate more than others. But still, the goal, the crossbench in the House and the Senate, we have a standing meeting on during all the sitting weeks, and also the week before the sitting week. And that is the opportunity for people to share what they're up to talk about, any amendments or private members' bills or perspectives on legislation or events that they're hosting. And again, the benefit of that is that people, interrogate ideas, are aware of what each other are doing, but don't necessarily, certainly amongst sort of Zali, Kate and I, while on many issues we are aligned, and I would say, probably the vast majority, there's no sort of assumption that, okay, we're all going to act the same on all issues. And we have different communities, we work, we have and get different sort of expertise feeding into that. And so it's really there to be constructive. And I would say that's kind of how the real world works. I used to work in business, and you work with others in a very constructive way. The goal is to, for me, and I think for other members of the crossbench, the goal primarily is to get better outcomes from the Parliament and government for the Australian people. And that means how do you do that? Well, you work with whoever you can work with in a constructive way to achieve those outcomes. And that means working constructively across the crossbench, working constructively with the government, working constructively with the coalition, also the opposition, and some issues have more greater opportunity to do that than others. But we also get sort of a briefing from the government once a week on all the legislation, where generally the ministers will come and present to the crossbench and get questions on the legislation and follow up, depending on the perspective on that. And we sit down also every week with the opposition, and they will, bring different people on different issues as well. And I think this is quite a mature, frankly, approach to, the business of Parliament, which the business of Parliament is to make the best legislation that it can, and the best policy it can for the people of Australia. So, I think that's really wonderful. And I've give a particular shout out to Zali, Zali and Helen in particular, who had been there before. And so as a new MP, that it was invaluable to get that sort of perspective on, how to set up your office, how to start to deal with, inquiries from the community about issues, including, visa issues or, NDIS, or things where you're really solving problems for individuals who have got stuck or sort of fallen through a crack somewhere in the system. But also just to give us that sort of view on how does Parliament work and how do we most effectively achieve our outcomes. Zali, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that I think fascinates people a little bit. It bewilders the media and it stuns, I think, the major parties. Who hasn't seen at election time those headlines of, it will be chaos if we have too many independents or too big a crossbench, because there's a certain sort of security, I think, for our media and the major parties of, the dichotomy and the of just two major parties, and they don't like too much mess to that. And so there's always that fear that more people at the table is going to, be chaotic, when in fact, it's quite the opposite. It's often within the teams of the major parties that you have the power plays and the chaos and the shuffling leadership, whereas the crossbench, actually, we are very focused on being collaborative. And as Allegra said, we actually very rarely discuss how we intend to vote on any one piece of legislation. It really is up to all of us. But when the major parties in a sitting week, or Tuesday morning is when they caucus and they have their party meetings. So the crossbench will do potentially briefings on policy areas of people that want to come and brief the crossbench. But also we meet to discuss the agenda of the week and opportunities if there's a campaign, as Allegra said. And we do that with the Senate crossbench as well, because the government has a tendency to try and, separate the crossbench of the House and the Senate and pit us not against each other, but kind of by splitting people up, you can try and negotiate differently. And there is a lot more effectiveness in being across what's happening in both houses, so that we can really follow. For example, if we've put forward amendments in the House, others may put them forward in the Senate. The government will often say, look, we agree to those amendments in principle, but we will pass them, we'll deal with them in the other place. So to make sure that those in the other place know that that's where the opportunity is, and there's been that public commitment, positive sentiment around that kind of thing. I think what's really important for people to understand also is, that together, and I know we had some minutes once that were leaked to that were, released, and the newspapers kind of wrote about it like it was this crazy thing. And most people, the feedback I had from the community was how delighted people were to hear that we all met regularly and we all worked together and, approached it in a really productive, collaborative way. And so I think that's really important for people to understand. Just like in business, the more people you have around the table, the more views you hear, the more opportunity you have to come up with the right outcome that will help and support the bigger number of people in Australia. And we come with very different perspectives, right? I mean, Allegra, you and I have probably got fairly similar electorates up here in Sydney. Kate, is probably a bit of a reflection over in WA. But like Helen is very different. We now have Andrew G on the crossbench. He has a very different electorate. Everyone brings a very different perspective, and it's really interesting for me to always hear how everyone's community is responding to different issues. So that collaborative aspect, I think, is really important.
Look, I think that's right. And so, I was sitting down having coffee with this, a really impressive businesswoman the other day, and I said, what do you want from politics? And she said, look, I actually don't want the politics. She said, I would like, evidence-based, expert-informed, community, engaged policy that, developed, which is in the best interest of this country for the long term. That's what I want out of our governments. And the truth is that the sort of pendulum politics of the major parties where, I'm going to do this. No, when we come in, we're going to take it all down. No, when we come in, we're going to build it all up again. It doesn't work for that kind of, that forward, that building, I think, of constructive, dealing constructively with some difficult issues. And, I always say that the politics of Australia is actually in the centre. And I think that's, and so the major parties end up going on the other side to sort of be different to each other. And I think, what I think myself and, I think what we are trying to do on the crossbench is kind of come back to where the community is, because I think if you're aligned to where the community is, then you are developing policies that are in more likely to last, and also effectively stick. So, and I think that's exactly, I think, how we approach policy, as Zali outlined. We talk to the experts, we listen to each other, because just if it's going to only work in Wentworth, but it's going to not work in any other part of the country, I know that's not actually going to be a policy that really sticks. So, that is part of my job, is also to explain to Wentworth and to listen to Wentworth, but to share perspectives that, other parts of the country have on issues as well. Sorry, Zali.
I was going to say, on that, it's absolutely, I always feel people are looking for politics to be about policy, not power. And I feel the parties are about power, not policy. So I think it's always about who's in power and keeping the other side out of power, and not being willing to look at the merits of certain policies just because they're being offered up by the other side. And we often get, even if it's us, for example, if it's the crossbench offering it up versus the other side, it might be more palatable and then sometimes less palatable. Like it's really interesting. I find like the dynamics at play rather than the merits, in terms of sometimes the outcomes on the issues. And we can see that play out even within the crossbench. Obviously, you have a minor party like the Greens and I guess us independents, and you have different varying ranges of, I guess, political spectrum views there. I've got Bob Catter and Rebecca and Andrew and Di. It's very diverse on the crossbench. So it is really interesting where we end up landing on some issues, and everyone brings a little bit of difference to it, which is important. How are you going, Kate?
I think I'm back now. I've turned off my Wi-Fi. Is that better?
That is much better. Your phone is winning. Excellent. Well, Kate, I was going to move to the next question, which is around achievements of the crossbench, both, I guess, in this parliament, but also the last parliament. Is there any, what are some of the things, or how do you think about this, Kate? Do you want to start off?
Yeah, I think there are achievements in what we've achieved, but also how we're doing it. And I think both are important. So, keeping some issues on the agenda is really important, and I've focused on electoral reform, gambling reform, some things where government have made a commitment, but we're just not seeing it followed through on. And I think having that voice in the media, you can put some pressure on the government. I've introduced private members bill, legislation in those areas, and that is another tool that you can use. What I find is really interesting is in no other area do you get the best outcome by backing someone into the corner and shouting at them. So often to drive change, the most constructive approach is to meet with ministers, talk about the issues you have, rather than necessarily saying, here's an amendment, take it or leave it in public. working behind the scenes, and you don't always get credit for that. But if you're there for the outcome, not for the credit, it's a much more sensible way of working and much more consistent with the rest of the way the rest of the world works. The other thing that I think I'm really proud of is how we've changed the parliament, and people on both sides have said to me, it's better since you guys are here. And that's subtle and you can't always see it. But I think it is true that having these strong women in parliament who come with life experience from elsewhere, we look at things like question time and say, this is ridiculous. This is not what the country expects and we have to do better. And just having that reality check from outside provides some pressure on the parliament to behave better and actually meet expectations of the community. So that's a more subtle impact, but one that I think shouldn't be understated.
Absolutely. Zali, do you want to talk about what are you most proud of the achievements of the crossbench, both, in that parliament and the previous one, this parliament, the previous one?
Look, I very much back in what Kate was saying. I think a lot of times, people have been conditioned a little bit by the major parties to think that a win is a big amount of dollar signs on a new road or a new hospital or a new school, right? It's always these kind of, and in some ways, they're actually everything that's wrong about traditional politics, because there's that question of the why that's been achieved. What's really important is looking at the changes of the discussion, the policies, the areas. So if I come back to, the first thing the Albanese government did was legislate net zero by 2050. Now, that was not by accident. That's because so overwhelmingly communities had gotten behind and were demanding that to be a line in the sand in terms of climate action. The next cab off the rank was, implementing the National Anti-Corruption Commission. The NAC got implemented, albeit not quite as publicly as we would have liked to see, but ultimately still we do now have a National Anti-Corruption Commission. We've seen progress on a number of policy areas, which just wouldn't happen if we were not there beating the drum around those issues. I think it's important to also understand amendments that get passed or shifts in policy that occur. So even around some of the IR laws, for example, we were able to move the dial on the definition of small business and some of the applications of some of those changes. But as Kate said, some of the big areas where government will give a little bit of lip service to an issue when it's in the media, when they're under pressure, and then take a long time to deliver, and it requires perseverance to keep the issue at the forefront. So gambling reform, truth in political advertising, these are issues that can demand constant vigilance, because if not, those issues can backslide. As we've seen now with climate policy, right? We now have a coalition who are wanting to walk back commitments when it comes to interim targets. And that's incredibly dangerous. So it is so important to continue that pressure. More recently, I'd say look at domestic violence, for example, where I think, as Kate said, as strong women in parliament, for us, it's just, we've just absolutely had enough. And so asking those uncomfortable questions of the Prime Minister, which he sometimes does bite back a little. Kate and I have experienced those answers. I think you too, Allegra. But they're good. We have to challenge their comfort. The status quo is not delivering for Australia, and so it is incremental. All these changes add up to a very different situation. And I think the most telling is the crowd we have here today watching this, the amount of communities that are engaged, that realise we can do politics differently, we can do it better, and the fact that there is no such thing as a safe seat anymore in Australia, and that is a good thing. It means an MP has to work for their community.
And look, I would absolutely echo that, and I think there are the ways I think you can make a difference. I think, as you said, you can change the legislation through amendments and other things. And as a senior coalition person said to me the other day, it's very hard for oppositions to actually get amendments into government because there's no incentive, frankly, for either of them to do that. That's not how they play. But actually, there have been significant amendments driven from the crossbench, whether it's on NDIS, whether it's on climate, whether it's on industrial relations, on all sorts of different issues, on integrity, that have been driven by the crossbench. But it is also the pursuing of major issues that the community backs and that government cannot eventually ignore. And, the NAC and climate are clear ones. But another sort of concrete example is sort of fuel efficiency standards. Now, Labor was scared of doing something on fuel efficiency standards because, they had been skewered at the last election by Scott Morrison's, war on the weekend. But, we all took fuel efficiency standards to the election. And, I think every one of us, and, it was the first meeting I ever had with Chris Bowen, I said, this is really important. You can't ignore transport. The emissions are still going up in transport. This is a sensible thing to do. And, we all pursued that. And finally, we have just passed that legislation in the House. Another one is example on Services Australia, where, I'm sure if any of you have tried to contact Services Australia, there have been huge problems recently. And during a cost of living crisis, when many people are desperately reliant on support from government, the fact that you can't get through to Services Australia, you're not getting, the money that you need back quickly is really problematic. And so the whole of the crossbench, wrote to the Bill Shorten, and I, asked him questions in question time about this. And the truth is that the coalition didn't really want to push this because they knew they would get slapped back with robo-debt. So it's hard for them to actually push an agenda like Services Australia because the government will say, see how badly you did it, do we want more robo-debt? And so we actually achieved an outcome here. We've had significant more investment in Services Australia. Now, it's got a bit of work to do to actually make that the service, the actual, improvement. But you can achieve that through pressure on the crossbench when the pressure from the opposition is either not going to come or is going to be politicised. And I think that's super important. Now, I want to move to the next election. What do we think we might see? Certainly, with 125 electorates on the line here, I'd love to hear some reflections on Kate and Zali on what you think the communities represented in this call might achieve and the movement might achieve at the next election. Zali, Kate, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think it's really exciting that communities are organising for the next election. And it looks like success is binary in that you either get a community independent up or you don't. But it's really important to understand that it's not binary, that the mere existence of a movement in your electorate is going to shift the policy positions of the incumbent. And I think I underestimated that impact when we felt like we were just a bunch of people having a crack at something. We didn't really know what we were doing. It makes a difference, and people feel that pressure, and it will shift the policy direction if you're doing the work to find out what it is that your community cares about and making that public. So whether you have a win or not, it's still worth doing. And I do think we will see more community independence at the next election. And that's because people are seeing that there's a different way of doing politics, that their representative can actually be answerable and accountable to the community for every decision, every vote that's made, and be considering the community interest in every vote rather than following a party line. And people, there's no point telling you, people are disillusioned with the major party system. So I'm quite optimistic about that. What I hope and what I believe is that if we do end up with a minority government, the people who are in the balance of power are people who have made a commitment to their communities to be working in the interests of the country over the long term and make sensible decisions, as Zali said, not exchanging a policy position on a piece of legislation for a road or an infrastructure project, but really thinking about the long term and reducing that impact of pendulum politics from one side to the other, so that we have balanced politics with the centre really focusing on what's good for the country. And that, I think that's a really exciting thing at a time when democracies around the world are in a bit of trouble. And because we have preferential voting and compulsory voting, we do have a pull back to the centre, and I think that's going to really be good for Australia in the next few political cycles.
Yeah, I think that's right. Zali, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I think, look, one of the things that's fascinating about Australia compared to the rest of the world, if I look at the UK election or the US election happening later, is, as Kate said, with compulsory voting and our preferential voting system means that we don't quite get the extremes there, in terms of traditionally, like in the US, you only get the voters come out if they're really incensed about an issue. The middle is less engaged and so doesn't always come out. Whereas in Australia, it's compulsory, everybody comes out, which is fantastic. I think this election is going to be really interesting. I mean, obviously, what's happened.
Sorry about the cat.
The positioning by the opposition this week around an issue like nuclear, which I think is more about resisting, transition and interim targets and climate change policy, brings obviously some of the issues that many of us stood for back very much on the tables front and centre, and we can't be complacent about those. And I know so many communities are impacted, so we all care deeply. I think what's interesting is the media is a difficult beast as well for community independence. There are some elements of our media don't understand this, right? This is really deeply uncomfortable. They are used to a system where there are two major players. They have relationships with those players. They know how to deal with them, whether they agree with them or not. It's comfortable, it's safe, it's what they know. This is more challenging, right? This is decentralised. It is a lot of different communities. It's a lot of different voices. And so they find that really challenging, scary, and so then can really be against it. But at the same time, I think that's where there's so much opportunity. It's going to be interesting. What does a win look like as well? Like, as Kate said, just shifting the dial of engagement within a community and holding an MP to account and making sure it's not a safe seat, that you have to actually fight for that seat, you have to earn that right to represent that community, is a really big win in of itself. But, I think what's going to be interesting is, obviously the media has a tendency to say, are we going to see as big a growth to the crossbench as what we saw at the last election? If not, is that a win? Has the movement peaked? All of those things. What I think is fascinating is the primary vote for major parties keeps falling. We know their membership keeps falling, right? There are less and less members, but also the primary vote keeps dropping. At the last election in 2022, it was a third, right? A third for the coalition, a third for Labor, and a third for minor parties or independents. And I think that vote is only going to keep growing because people like competition. They like choice. If you think about in every aspect of our life, we embrace having choice as consumers in business. We want to make sure we understand our options and we pick what suits us. So the most important thing that can happen at the election is choice on the ballot paper. People can, it's compulsory voting. You can only vote for what's there. It's very difficult in a community if there is no alternative choice to vote for. So that's why it's fantastic to see so many communities here engaged. To put up a candidate, put up an independent, is a way of giving your community choice. And, from small things, big things grow. And you do build momentum. The more you have the conversation, the more people you realise feel the same way as you.
I think that's absolutely right. And, I think there's this, there are forces in democracy around the world that are pulling countries apart and actually fraying the democracy. They're sort of populism, post-truth, and sort of polarisation, the 3 Ps, which I think are very powerful forces. And I think the best antidote to those forces is actually community engagement, because if the community are talking to each other, listening to each other, hearing different views and trying to sort of coalesce around what are the sort of majority views and of the community, then you start to really pull people together and in a very positive and important way. And I think that is an additional benefit to, I think, the sort of independent movement is actually community engagement. Most of the people people on my campaign said they've never been involved in politics before, and they are from all walks of life, all ages and stages, and that they feel a strength and sense of community here, which I think is incredibly important. I know.
Sorry, just quickly on that community engagement point, and I wanted to make this point earlier. We hold a lot of events around policy and turn that into community submissions on NDIS, aged care, housing, range of issues. And one of the real benefits of that is people come together in a room and hear each other's perspectives. And I think it actually improves the quality of debate in that rather than sitting in your polarised position and just thinking you're right and everyone else is wrong, if you go into a room and hear different perspectives, it enriches the quality of the conversation, and I think then the quality of the policy that we make as well. And the community independent movement really offers that ability to recognise nuance and listen to each other.
Look, I think you're absolutely right. We did something on housing, for instance, a community event on housing, and having perspectives of owners, mortgage holders, renters, people who working in the homeless sector, essential workers, they all have different perspectives on these issues. And it is actually the listening, the empathy that you develop from understanding how other people are feeling that actually helps, I think, develop, again, more nuanced and more, probably in many cases, more centrist policy. There's an observation I know that came up in the chat, that, New South Wales's government's in a minority government, has been for the last, probably a couple of years before that as well. It's not that, when people talk about chaos, it's not, the chaos was, Gladys leaving and, Dominic Perrottet and those things. It was not, coming on, unexpectedly. It wasn't coming from the minority aspect of the government. And I think a bunch of people in New South Wales wouldn't even realise that, because the government is still able to pursue an agenda, but, has to work with a group of people who have strong views of their community and help balance that agenda, with strong voices of the community. I think that is super powerful. And one other question I will cover briefly before everyone gets 1 minute to wrap up with, something on truth in advertising. Zali, did you want to mention Zali and Kate, basically, do you want to comment on that? Because that's sort of a question or comment that's come up about where is that up to and how important is it? Zali, do you want to kick it off?
Look, it is coming up, and it's going to be on the agenda in the next sitting fortnight. Obviously, we've had a few goes at it, trying to, truth in political advertising and voter protections, and Kate has included it as well in the Restore Politics bill. So we've had a lot of discussions with Don Farrell and the government. I've raised it directly with the Prime Minister in one-on-one conversations. There is a commitment by the government to implement truth in political advertising. We know it has worked. It's been in place for some time in South Australia, in the ACT. Ironically, we're now talking about other legislation around deep fakes, and, we need to address deep fakes in political advertising as well. So there is a commitment to it, but like other things, it's a little bit slippery at the moment where they're landing. And they've said in principle, yes, they will do it, possibly not to come into effect for this election, but the next one, in conjunction with donation reform. So we haven't seen any exposure draft though, and we haven't seen really where the government has landed. And there is a great fear that the government will do a deal with the opposition, with the coalition, so that major parties essentially cementing their duopoly, right? And trying to prevent a more competitive arena. And that can be done by many ways, which prevents, gives an incumbent an advantage and prevents newcomers to come in and really challenge the situation. And we've actually seen that in state politics at New South Wales and Victorian level, very much more difficult for independents to challenge through because of the restrictions. So very focused on truth in political advertising. We see a lot of misinformation around a lot of issues. Around the latest has been around nuclear, where there's a lot of misleading comparisons that are made and facts that are put out it's just not correct. And a liberal democracy cannot afford to enter a Trumpian arena of alternate facts all of a sudden, having the same billing as real facts. So truth in political advertising is very important. I'm very committed to it. It's one of those areas, coming from the private, a non-politician, I was shocked to hear that every other aspect of our lives and advertising, it has to be, can't be misleading or deceptive, but yet in politics it's a free-for-all. So very committed to it, and hopefully in the next sitting fortnight we will start to get some movement. If not, I will, Kate and I haven't told Kate yet, but I'm sure she'll join me. We will be making some more noise on this issue.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to move to wrap it up so that we can keep this fabulous convention on time. So, Kate, do you have, I'll go to you first, Kate, then Zali, then I'll come to me, in terms of, final words to the communities around the country who've joined us this morning on this call?
Go for it is my main bit of advice. Don't feel like you're ill-equipped. Talk to as many people as you can. Find out what the issues are that people really care about, and back yourself to have a crack, because whether or not you get a candidate up, you will be changing politics, and it is incredibly empowering to actually be doing something instead of just shouting at the TV. So you'll meet like-minded people. You will change the country in your in a small way. You will actually have that change, and you'll get a deep sense of purpose and satisfaction from the fact that you are actually participating in our democracy. So I'm really excited for all the people who are on this call, who are at the beginning of the journey that I've been on, and it's a wild adventure. It's incredibly stressful and rewarding and frustrating, and a whole lot of different things, but it's worth doing. So good luck.
Okay, Zali, did you want to add anything to that?
Definitely the go for it, but I would just say, once you've dream big, set a big goal, and then break it up into baby steps, right? You don't finish the marathon straight away. You have to work with, you do the training in between. So the big goal, dream big, absolutely go for that big ambition, and then just break it up into the manageable chunks, a step at a time, and before you know it, you'll be so much further down the road and a successful journey for your community.
And you should listen to Zali, because not only is she an Olympic skier, she also runs 100 kilometres. So when she's talking about a marathon, I think she knows what she's talking about. Look, I'm really going to add to it that there's enormous joy in the process, and there's joy, in the job, frankly, of being a representative, but there's enormous joy on working with your community. You'll meet different people, you work with different people, and your lives will be richer for that. So I think it's super exciting what so many communities around the country are doing. So thanks so much for listening this morning, and have a wonderful convention.